Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this IESE webinar on managing business in a crisis. My name is Kip Meyer. I'm the Director for Custom Programs with IESE here in New York, and I'm joined today by Professor Mike Rosenberg, Professor of Strategy. We're coming to you from our campus on 57th Street in Manhattan. And before we get started, I just need to go through some housekeeping. Mike's going to talk for 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. For today's session, we're asking you to please type in your questions into the chat box. For those of you maybe unfamiliar with WebEx, if you move your cursor on your screen, icons will open up, and there is a chat balloon icon on the right side. I think it might be for you the second or third icon from the right, and that will open up the panel and allow you to type in your questions. And please, if you can type it to all participants, assuming that's an option, otherwise you can send it to the host, and we will see those as we go. Today's session is being recorded, so we will send you all the link afterwards. And with that, Mike, if you're ready, we can dive in. So where are we now?
Where are we now? Hello, Kip, and hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. And Kip, thank you for setting this up. I mean, this is an unfolding situation, and really what any of us are trying to do is to help and to be as useful as we can. Where are we now? So I downloaded the latest data I could from the World Health Organization and from the Center for Disease Control here in the United States. And I think most of you are probably familiar with the numbers and familiar with the figures that we're getting. You know, there's 93,000 confirmed state cases around the world. 80,000 of those are in China, and there's 12,000, almost 13,000 outside of China. This thing has gotten out of China. I mean, this is the reality. In this country, there's 80 cases confirmed to the CDC. They're in specific states. Of those 80 cases, according to the CDC, 24 have been people who have been traveling somewhere else. There's 16 where it's person-to-person, people talking to those people, and there's 40 cases that they don't really know where they came from, but they are investigating. These are the data, and one of the reasons I'm going through the data, Kip, is not so much because you know, our alumni and our people who are tuned in today don't have access to the same data. But I think it's very important, and Martin Reeves from the BCG, he said the same thing. You know, no matter how, even if you think people know the data, you should tell them the data again. Yeah. It's very important to keep control of the narrative in this context, in this crisis. There is, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of news. There's a lot of fake news. And the more I think people in management, people with responsibility can do to ground us in whatever data we do have, I think is helpful now. You know, can we believe all the data that comes from China? I don't know. I tend to believe the data that comes from the Center of Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, but maybe that's my own bias, you know, who knows?
So are we in a crisis?
That I think is a really good question. And you know, if we look at the data and we look at the data compared to something else, so if we compare the data to the flu virus is of course coming every year. The flu virus is deadly. Right now, according to the authorities here, you know, there's already been 18,000 deaths of the flu in the United States. You know, 12 million people are infected. So from a health point of view, it's not clear if this is really that big a deal or not in terms of numbers. Now, of course, if you have friends or family who are affected, this is a terrible personal crisis. But when we think about what's a crisis and what's not a crisis, there's a Frenchman, Patrick Lagadac, and he, at least in my view, is probably the foremost authority in the world on crisis management. And Lagadac distinguishes very clearly between what's an accident and a crisis. What he talks about is if something happens often, you know, even if it's terrible, an airplane crash, but it happens often, he says that's an accident, you know, and it happens, we know more or less the probability that it's going to happen. We know what to do if it does happen. We know who to get involved. We know if insurance pays for it or not, etc. A crisis is when we don't know what's going on. Crisis is when things are unexpected, when the response is ad hoc at best. And I think if we look at this situation, it's clearly a crisis. It's a crisis. And again, it's not because the coronavirus is that deadly. I think most of you are aware that the virus will give you a very fast case of viral pneumonia if you are susceptible to that. And that's at 2 to 5% of the people who get it. And if you are old or infirm or have COPD or some kind of pre-existing condition, it can kill you. This is reality. The mortality numbers, the percentage of people who are dying as opposed to people who are getting sick, are scary as hell. They're about 3.7% at the latest studies. But we know pretty well what the numerator is, the number on the top. And we only have, a guesstimate of what the number on the bottom is. Because while we know how many, people have been tested and tested positive, we don't know how many people have not been tested. And we don't know how many people are walking around with this thing or in their houses or whatever, who have not come to the attention of the authorities. In H1N1, which was another flu a few years ago, when it first came out, the mortality was 4%, but by the time they got all the data, they figured out it was 0.007%. 0.07%. So from a healthcare management point of view, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm probably the wrong guy to ask anyway. But there is an issue here in terms of the economic impact. And the economic impact, I think, kind of like in November 2008, nobody knows how long this is going to go on. Nobody knows what the impact's going to be. And if I could just show a picture, this isn't the picture I took on the airplane. This is a stock photo, but this is the interior of a 737-300. I flew over on Friday from Barcelona on a Delta Airlines flight with 20 people on the plane. Right. There's 261 seats on a Delta 737-300, which, if you do the math, that's about a little bit less than 8%, and the airlines are losing a fortune because people aren't flying. And I think it's the economic danger more than anything else which is pushing us into crisis. And by the way, if we can, I wanted to do a poll. I wanted to ask you all with a poll, if you've noticed impact in your own business. Ricardo, can you launch the poll? Yeah. So the choices here are: have you seen no impact at all from an economic point of view? Have you had some weak signals coming in to your business? It's hard to tell exactly what's going on, but you see some indications. Or has there been moderate impact? Or has there been a severe impact, like I can imagine the airlines are suffering? So we'll leave the poll up for a couple of moments to see if people can respond. And
so, Mike, I don't know if you're going to cover this later, but like the flight, there seem to be different phases. That there's a strong emotional decision-making response right now, and then what you're suggesting is how to move beyond that.
Absolutely, and I'll get to that in a minute, okay. which is kind of what are the phases of crisis response, okay, and how to manage through a crisis. I'm just curious to see what people are seeing, because at least on an anecdotal level, here in New York this week, I've seen some indications that the crisis is real. People who don't want to travel, people don't want to come to the city. As you know, we've had a couple of our clients postpone things that we're planning to do, right. But it's more somewhere between weak signals and a moderate impact. So I'm curious to see what people say. Ricardo, do you want to close the poll in a minute or two and see if people have answered yet? I don't know, Ricardo, if you have any data. I know it takes you a few minutes to do the math and to calculate everything.
Because I noticed, walking around New York, you see a few masks. I take the commute in from on the train, and it seems like slowly the traffic is getting a little lighter. There seem to be fewer people out and about, fewer people on the train just at the moment. But
yeah, we've got a couple of responses. We have some weak signals. A lot of people with weak signals. Not too many people yet with a severe response, and that's kind of what I would expect, because we really don't know how far this thing's going to go. But let me go to your other question, which is kind of what to do, which is probably why most people signed up for the webinar. Yeah. Which is, hey, where are we? What do we do? So Lagadak, says in crisis management. And first, I'll talk a little bit about what the steps are in general, and then if you don't mind, I'll go into some detail on this specific crisis. He says there's 5 phases. The anticipating phase is to get the people around the table who are going to have to deal with this. And this is an important issue, which is who do you put onto your crisis committee? And probably most companies should have a group of people meeting on a regular basis already with some frequency about talking about what does this mean, where are we going, what should we do. That I think is critically important. But one of the issues is who to put on the group. And the typical response is, well, but we'll put the head of each of our different functions, and we'll have to make sure everybody's there.
Mm-hmm.
But what's important, Kip, is that the people in a room like this, in this kind of committee, need to be able to deal with information which is not perfect. They need to be able to make wild guesses.
Mm-hmm.
They need to move quickly, and they may need to kind of break through the organizational rules and boundaries. And if you get the typical managers in place, they may not be the ones who can think that fast, because a lot of people in management are not those people, if you follow what I mean.
Right. So for any of our folks, like if they are not aware that a crisis management team has already been created, that might be one first.
Absolutely. And one of the issues here is there's 5 phases here, but communication has to start at the beginning, and communication has to work all the way through the phases. So anticipating is, it would be nice if you kind of had these people know each other before you start.
Yeah.
Maybe it's too late for that. Detecting is looking at those weak signals and trying to make sense of them, trying to know where we are, trying to know what's going on, trying to find out if there is an economic impact, if there is actual health concerns, etc. Reacting is really about what to do next, and the danger of a crisis is people get stuck. Anxiety is when you know you should move and you don't want to move. That's what anxiety is. And there's really 3 problems. One is anxiety, and we don't do anything because we don't know what to do. The other is denial, saying, well, this can't possibly be a thing, so we're not going to do anything.
Right.
And the third one is overreaction, because there's, oh my God, it's a crisis, so we have to do something. So reaction is very important. It's got to be the crisis management team together with very strong leadership who directs that. The 4th phase, what the Lagadak calls inventing, is where the creativity comes in, which is, can we come up with a solution to achieve the mission of the organization, to achieve what our goals are, but in a way which is somehow responsive to the crisis. And this is where you might have to break the rules. You might have kind of a fundamental rupture with what you're normally doing to come up with something totally different to make it work. And then mobilization is to get the word out and get people to say, this is how we're going to deal with it. Now, the comms, the communication, has to be measured in each of those steps. And you can't be telling people this is the solution if you don't know what it is yet. And if you're still in the detection mode, you have to tell people, hey, this is going on and we're trying to find out what's going on. So it's very important to get the communication and to own the narrative, but to keep it in these different phases.
Right. Now, so you're talking about pulling together a crisis management team, and then there's the inventing team. Are the inventing team and the crisis management team?
I think they might be the same people, but you can have a team which then gets bigger or smaller depending upon what's going on. But what you want to make sure of is that there's clear leadership, clear lines of responsibility, and there's a group of people who are making decisions on what to do.
Right.
And those people have to have the flexibility, the mental agility to get it. So I think my recommendation would be to have the same team.
Okay.
Because if you have too many teams, you're going to get conflicting things going on. Now in this crisis, this crisis in particular, it's probably too late for anticipation.
Yeah.
But one of the issues that happens is you're getting different types of people together to make decisions that they don't know each other really well, and they're not really sure of who's what. And the sooner you can get them to gel as a team, the better. In terms of detection, the United States is finally producing testing kits, which is helpful. Should you call customers up and ask them, are they, what's your plans? Or if by calling them up, I think, transparency, honesty, this is the only way through it.
Right.
Hoping that they don't call because you don't want them to get, no. Call people, talk about it, see what's going on, make decisions. Because we have had, the Mobile World Congress was canceled, the London Book Fair was canceled.
Yeah.
This thing is kind of boomeranging, which gets to the whole reaction issue. And I'll talk about this a little bit later if I could, but the question is what to do. and which steps to take. And I'll get to that, but when we get to the inventing phase in this particular crisis, I think what's absolutely critical is to stay true to the mission of the organization that you belong to.
Yep.
And if part of your mission statement is customers first, then customers first. If part of your mission statement is to get things done, I mean, this I think is when you really see, if people mean it, and can you find novel and interesting ways to get around it. And then mobilization again is moving. Where are we today? My guess is most people are on detecting and reacting at this moment in time in this crisis, because it's a new phenomenon.
And is this, I mean, it seems like this is a question of hours, maybe days. This is not a 3-month project. There's urgency at the moment.
There's urgency. I think you've got to get to inventing relatively quickly. The problem is we don't know how far this is going to go.
Yeah.
And we don't know how long it's going to take. SARS and H1N, I mean, these were scary, and 3 months later they were kind of more relaxed.
Right.
Is this going to be business as usual in September? Is this going to be business as usual in 2021? And the only way I know really to deal with that is to run scenarios in real time.
Okay.
And to get your people to talk about what does it mean if this thing gets really bad over the next 3 to 12 months? What does it mean for us if this thing kind of gets under control in 3 to 12 months? There was a very interesting tape with President Donald Trump, and most of you who know me know that I'm not very much a fan of President Donald Trump, but that's okay. But he was meeting with the pharmaceutical industry, and he was saying that he wants a vaccine in 3 months, and they were trying to explain to him very patiently that to create the molecule might take 3 months, but then it has to be properly tested, because vaccines can have terrible side effects, and it has to be done properly, and probably there will not be any vaccine for at least 12 to 18 months from now. So the what I would urge every company to do is part of this detecting and inventing phase is to kind of stress test the business and see what happens if this happens, what happens if that happens, what happens if this takes longer, what happens if this can be kind of put to bed relatively quickly.
Should we ask our participants if they've been doing anything so far themselves?
Yeah, but let me just show them the next slide, because the next slide is really where I was going to ask them to do that. And maybe you can use the chat box if you can open that up. The first thing to do is keep your people safe. I mean, this is clearly in the reaction box. And does that mean to buy hand sanitizer and put it all over the place? Does that mean to restrict travel, which many of our corporate customers have done? Does that mean to send everybody home? What are the right responses in safety first? One thing that my eldest daughter was explaining to me this morning over breakfast is, the idea in some places to call in sick is complicated. From the doctor, maybe you don't get sick pay, you don't get this kind of stuff. Probably one thing to do would be to make it really easy for people to call in sick. Mm-hmm. Pay them anyway, make it, relatively seamless process, because what you don't want to do is you don't want someone who is you're going to be in contact with a lot of people who doesn't feel well to feel that they have to go to work or they're not going to get paid or they can't be bothered to get to the doctor. So what I'd love to do is see the chat box here and see if
actually, Mike, you've got the mouse.
Oh, I have the
so
mouse.
If you can open up if you can get the cursor up top on chat.
Oh, okay.
And just to the left, that the arrow on just to the left of that word. If you click on that, there you go.
Yeah. So my question to all of you is what are you doing to keep your people safe? And the reason we're using the chat, and I'd like to send the chat to everyone, is because I think all of you might benefit from seeing what all of you are doing, if that makes any sense.
Yep. So you might have to scroll. I know that I'm looking at some ideas around creating travel policies, outlining locations and events that are off limits. People are pre-ordering materials from crisis locations globally, so they're already starting to affect the supply chain, decision making. with keeping the customer in mind. Some folks are opening up flexible work from home situations, and actually quite a few are doing that. Voluntary quarantine of employees who have returned from affected countries, so people are getting ahead of that.
I mean, I think that's a very responsible thing to do. My cousin, one of the things which shocked me this trip, my cousin and his family had been to Rome and Florence, and when they came back, they put themselves in quarantine.
Right.
Just because they thought maybe someone on the plane had come from Milan or Lombardy and stuff, and it actually postponed the kid's 10th birthday. And he was okay with that.
Okay.
Which I thought was very noble of the guy.
All of the usual wash your hands and the advice there, but a number of postponing events, postponing meetings. But I'm just sort of looking through this, and in terms of what you were talking about earlier, in terms of forming a crisis management committee and making sure that there's information sessions.
I would guess that a lot of this stuff is coming out of crisis management committees, but what we need to do is, I think safety first is the right answer, but we need to make sure we don't overreact and cancel everything. I don't know if you remember that. I think I gotta click this thing, right?
Click on that.
So I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie Vanilla Sky. It's a Tom Cruise movie, and it starts. The movie starts, and he wakes up, normal day, and he gets in his car, and he's driving around New York City, and there's nobody there, nobody anywhere, nobody in Times Square, nobody. If safety first means send everybody home and postpone everything, and stop doing everything, then what we are in danger of is triggering a global economic crisis, which will be much more devastating than COVID-19 ever will be.
Right.
That's the danger.
Right.
And the New York Times this morning actually ran a very nice, or very kind of spooky video showing the coronavirus from space, zooming in on different places around the world where you see no people. So this is an image from that in Tiananmen Square. Now, on the other side, I was able to go to the Knicks last night, the American basketball, the New York City basketball game here. They lost to the Utah Jazz, and I guess the Knicks often lose. But the stadium was full.
The stadium was full.
More or less. I mean, here's a picture of it. I took it with my phone.
Yeah.
And it was business as usual. And on the court, it was business as usual. And that gave me hope, Kip, that as we deal with this crisis and do the right thing to keep our people safe, we're not gonna stop the world.
Right.
And I think that's really the fundamental conundrum. Is where do you draw the line, and how do you balance that?
And it's not going to be on off. It's not going to be. It's going to go through cycles where you're going to think things are better for a little bit, and then you're going to get maybe some news, and then we'll react to that, and then there'll be another sort of, and anticipating the cycles,
right?
And trying to evaluate what's the level, what's the risk level in this cycle. Are we getting better at communicating and managing what we're doing? Are we paying attention to the patterns?
And this is where inventing, if we go back to the model that I mentioned earlier, the inventing thing is so critical, which is how do you reinvent what you're doing in a way which keeps things running, keeps people safe, and let's face it, keeps cash flow coming in.
Right.
Because if the business, if you're sourcing material from China, which isn't coming, and you're selling stuff, and you're not able to sell anything because you're not getting any material, and cash flow comes, then you get into massive cost reduction programs, furloughing employees, which will only produce more panic and more economic problems.
Right.
So I think really the challenge, if you will, and to some degree the responsibility. And at IESE Business School, as you know, we like to talk about responsibility as well as opportunity.
Yeah.
Is to do the right thing, keep people safe, keep the lights on, and keep the business viable. That's really the nutshell of what I think we have to do. Recognizing that we're in a crisis mode. Probably most people are in detection and reaction. and need to push into this invention phase quickly in order to come up with cool ideas.
So what are some elements within that invention phase? Are there any
Well,
particular tools? Or?
Well, we mentioned earlier to run scenarios about where things could go. I think you need to get broad ideas into that team. Clearly, as some of the chat boxes saying, the digitalization of what you can do. Here at the business school, we're preparing contingencies. If we had to, could we teach certain classes from home? Well, yeah, we can.
Yeah.
And we're actually building out that social contingency planning and kind of what if scenarios is critically important, and really making sure you know what those plans are and putting them together as quickly as you can, just in case you need them. Because if you do need them, you're going to have to put them in place.
So in terms of those scenarios, are there any tactical, who can do scenario? Everybody can do scenarios? Should you be helping your team, or if you gather your team and you actually proactively go through a scenario exercise, that actually lets everybody feel like they're contributing, being part of the solution, coming up with ideas.
So the one thing you may do is bring people from outside the team as well, and even people from different walks of life.
Yeah.
People who have different points of view.
Customers, or maybe?
Customers could be, absolutely. I'm thinking more about if you're in more of a bricks and mortar business, maybe get some guys who understand the digital world.
Yeah.
And bring them into helping you with your scenarios. If you're in the digital world, maybe there's a face-to-face component which you're missing.
Yeah.
It's to kind of push the limits about what you know how to do. If all of your buyers are focused on buying things from Asia, maybe you need someone who knows how to buy things from someplace else.
Well, there's a question here about just-in-time inventory and the weakness, the challenges of that kind of system.
But I think if we move, we've been talking a little bit about this crisis and the phases of crisis management. If we move beyond that a little bit, if you do get time to breathe, assuming we all get time to breathe, pretty soon, it would have been nice to have a scenario in place already, which is describing this crisis. And I'm not sure if everybody saw it, but there was an article in the New York Times about a week ago. Peter Daszak wrote, and he was an epidemiologist who works for the WHO, and they ran a workshop in 2018 where they talked about disease X.
Mm-hmm.
And disease X is COVID-19. They didn't know it was going to be COVID-19, and they didn't know it was going to happen now. But the experts knew that sooner or later a virus like this would get out. Yeah, and it would be more severe than SARS, and then here it is.
Yep.
But of course, very few people in business listen to that. And when you listen to the epidemiologists on the radio or on a podcast, there's a certain degree of "I told you so" as they talk.
Yeah.
And I think part of their, sometimes you might say they're alarmist. I think they're just convinced that this could be really bad, because those were the scenarios that they ran back in the day. So if we do ever get a little bit, if you and your company ever do get a little bit of space, I think one thing to do clearly is to run scenarios for the future. And it's not only viruses. There might be political issues, there might be geopolitical issues, there might be war. But typically, and I've been talking about this for a long time, business leaders, we don't do a good job thinking about terrible things that can happen. Things that Nassim Taleb calls black swans.
Right. Now, there was a question, so not just looking future-wise in terms of scenarios, but, one question is, are there any scenarios where normal business is not affected? And as you're looking at your enterprise to do scenarios, like what are the unintended consequences? What are the pieces that within our own organization, how one affects the other? I mean, the role of a manager to see connections and understand the implications of those connections.
Well, what you're really getting at is systems theory, which is how things are connected. And to go back to the just-in-time supply chain thing, what we see is companies for the last 20 or 30 years have gotten more and more and more efficient, but perhaps less resilient. And for resilience, I go to nature. I go to the ecology. The Stockholm Center for Resilience, which is all focused on ecology, they have 7 principles of resilience.
Right.
And resilience is to be able to withstand stuff, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they're pandemics or whether they're economic shocks or political shocks. And part of it is they have 7 principles. I think the most important really are the first few, which I put up here. This house, by the way, I don't know if you know the story about this house. This is called the Sand Palace. This is a town called Mexico Beach in Florida, which was basically knocked flat by a hurricane in October 2018.
Right.
The town was destroyed, except for this guy's house and maybe one other house down the street. But when he built the house to withstand the biggest storm that anybody had ever seen, far above the building code.
Yeah.
And when the storm hit, his was the only big house left. In fact, the federal government asked to borrow the house because they needed a place to stage the cleanup operation in his house.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a resilient house, and I could talk a long time about the house. I'm a fan of the house, but do you have redundant systems? Do you have diversity of supply? Schneider Electric, for example, they have 2 sources of supply of everything they buy.
Really?
One in Asia and one somewhere else, just in case. And they've been doing that for years. Now that's expensive.
Right.
That's expensive. Just-in-time inventory. You've got 2 days of stock.
Yeah.
You're in trouble if there's a disruption of supply, and car factories in South Korea have stopped because they need supplies. They need parts from Wuhan.
Right.
So as these things happen and spread through the economy, we're seeing how our hyper-efficient focus, which has been good for the bottom line, has in many cases made companies less resilient than they need to be. Just to finish this, and then maybe we'll open up to questions, because this is really the last thing I wanted to say today in terms of concepts or conceptual work, is diversity and redundancy of the important things you're doing. Connectivity, this is making sure you do manage the connections between places. Some variables happen slowly. When I left Barcelona, I think there were 2 people that were sick. Now there's more.
Yeah.
And it's not so slow anymore. And as these things go through progressions, it's going to get faster. Adaptive systems is knowing and trying to guess how all the stuff is connected and not just having one laser focus. So again, when you go to the crisis management team, do you have people on the team who see these connections?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you have super specialists in their area who may have a hard time communicating with each other? The others here are encouraged learning, which is really very important, of making sure you get everybody involved. And the last one, which is interesting, is what these guys call polycentric governance systems. What does that mean? That means having different nodes of people making decisions which are connected but are autonomous to make the decisions they need to make. So if you have a unit in the United States, what they have to do is perhaps different than in Spain, which is perhaps different than what you have to do in China.
Okay.
And having the ability for people to actually move on and do stuff is very important.
So as a manager orchestrating all of that, and the control, the importance of allowing the other parts of the organization do that. So this is not I don't know, is this a situation where really managers have to push themselves to deal with the decentralized, it's a networked, but a decentralized.
Leadership, it's an overused word.
Yeah.
But what we'll see in this crisis is the real leaders, strong leaders, but leaders who are able to get the right people together and let them get on with it. Leaders who are able to delegate when you have to.
Yeah.
And who are able to draw the line and say, no, we're not going to do that when you have to. That's really what we're going to see is, because this is, you see who people are in a crisis.
Yeah.
Colonel Tom Kuldis, the guy who wrote In Extremis Leadership, he wrote about that, where it's when things are serious, that's when you really see old-fashioned things like integrity, willingness to listen, willingness to lead from the front.
Yep. Great. All right. So we've gone through all of that. Let's invite some questions. If you could type them into the chat, if you have any specific questions that are on your mind that you've been thinking about. I know, after this call is over, what are 2 or 3 suggestions or recommendations you might have to?
Well, I mean, one thing I would definitely urge any group, any company which does not have it, is to put together a team. And that team, again, has to have the right kind of people on it. And those people may not be the bosses of the different areas.
Right.
They're people who can see through things, people who can make connections, and people who can make decisions based upon not too much data.
Yep.
I think another thing which is critically important is to get the comms right, to get the communication platform in place to make sure you know who's communicating, what they're communicating, and to line up the communications with wherever you are in the cycle.
Yeah.
If you're still in detection mode, then say so.
Right.
Say we're trying to find the information, but
Yeah.
maybe by repeating, you know, the official statistics, it may be helping people get a sense of what's true and what's not true, and how scary or not scary is the disease is helpful.
Right.
You know, let's face it, if you're not over 70 and you've never had a respiratory problem, and you live in a place with, you know, fantastic healthcare, probably in the early days of this crisis, you know, there's not too much to worry about.
Right.
You know, in the middle of a massive pandemic, you know, where all the hospitals are full, which is what happened in Wuhan,
Yeah.
you know, then, but still, 95% of people who get this thing are fine.
Yeah.
The others get the needed acute care. So it's about getting the team right, getting the comms right, and taking measured steps, I think, to keep people safe, but to keep the lights on and make sure that the business is viable.
So, yeah, and a few questions about small businesses and small, medium enterprises versus the big ones. I mean, the big ones may have bureaucracy and you've got to navigate through that, but they've got a lot of resources and they might be able to survive. Whereas some of the smaller, medium organizations, as you say, keeping the lights on, have less resources to be able to.
Absolutely. But I think through integrity and working with people, I think you can figure out a way through it. I mean, should you furlough all your employees if you own a coffee shop?
Mhm.
Well, you know, there's not a lot of people maybe coming into the coffee shop in certain parts of the world right now.
Yeah.
One thing I think, for example, that most businesses should think about is for people in the front line, people who are talking to customers all the time, the people at the counter, the cashier, the teller. You know, what can you do to keep them safe?
Yeah.
Should they be wearing a mask? Should you build a little plexiglass thing to keep, you know, customers just another foot away?
Yeah.
Which again, I understand can do a lot in terms of slowing the spread of the disease.
Yeah.
You know, what steps can you take which are sensible, keep people safe, but keep things going?
Well, we were talking about, you know, I mean, even as simple as for people who aren't feeling well, you know, just stay home and.
Right, but if you're a gas station attendant and you don't get paid if you don't show up for work.
Yeah.
And you don't feel well, you might go to work anyway. And maybe the good thing would be to make it easy for that person to stay home. And some lazy people might stay home and watch TV. Well, you know, is that the worst thing that we're going to get? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, if there are any other questions, please feel free to type those in. You know, one question I was thinking about is, this all seems very logical. You know, some of us find ourselves around the table or in meetings where you're not getting a completely rational view of things that are going on. And so I don't know if you have any advice or thoughts where, you know, if you find yourself, you know, because of business pressures or whatever, not getting pushed into decisions that maybe are not the best long-term or develop risks, you know.
Yeah.
How to.
Let me add that to one of your questions, which is, you know, how should companies respond to minimum wage employees that might not be eligible to work from home? You know, what's the right thing to do?
Yeah.
If you're in a part of the world with a massive outbreak, you know, probably the right thing to do is to tell them to stay home and tell them, don't worry, we're going to pay you whatever we can pay you. Maybe it's 50% of salary, maybe it's 80%.
Yeah.
Depending upon how big the company is and how much money they have. And even a small business, I think, could talk to their employees honestly about that. If you're in a larger organization and you're being asked to do stuff you don't feel comfortable with, then I think the right thing to do is to say, I don't feel comfortable with that, and not to do it.
Yeah.
And then if that puts in jeopardy, you know, your long-term prospects from a career point of view, well, maybe it's the wrong company to work for. And I'm sorry for being so clear, but I think it's in these kinds of moments, Kip, when people really see who they are and who their boss is and who the company they work for.
Well, this is that challenge of sort of the short-term actions and conversations that are going on, and then, as you say earlier, recognizing that this will not be the last crisis situation we may be confronted with. And so, preparing yourself and helping to prepare the organization so that, you're having, how often are you getting your team together to have a debrief and say, what did we do? What did we learn? I think even connected to your comment about polycentric governance systems, and there was a question about that, is some organizations where it's not working that well, that critical element of communication.
Right, the question is about different business units doing different things, which is unhelpful. So yes, again, it's a question of leadership for me. Is there a common thread between those different centers? They need to be connected.
Yeah.
I mean, so yes, your business unit's going to do this, my business is going to do that, but we are connected and we're telling each other that we're doing different things. And there's somebody who's saying that's okay, and someone's able to explain it to the world.
Right.
Because if we cannot explain it to the world, and if it doesn't make sense, because if your business unit is very high tech, high touch, and lots of people involved, maybe you have to do one thing, and the other business unit is maybe much more remote,
Right.
And maybe they're not in, or one's in South Korea in the towns which are affected, and the other one might be in New York City, where so far there's really very little virus to be seen.
Right. Right. And in those businesses where the communication or whatever is not working, I mean, this is one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar, to be able to help with ideas. IESE as a school is very eager and interested in helping. Sometimes it does help to bring in, whether it's an outside partner, a customer, someone who can help with the scenario planning, the other strategy workshops of getting people together. And we love asking the hard questions that sometimes it's hard for a business to ask itself. And then also, as we learn, and as a school, there was a comment of, what is IESE doing to help feed back to governments, policymakers, and we're very active now in contributing to that conversation as well. So, I mean, and again, the question about data, going back to Mike's earlier point, is the challenge of sifting and filtering the data that comes in and looking for sources of good, valid information so that you can make good decisions as you go. And that's a hard question. I don't know.
Well, there's a question on data on supply chains, and is there data on disruption? And I think what I understand is we're still drawing down stocks in many parts of the world.
Yeah.
But what I would recommend, if anybody hasn't done this already, is to really look deep at their supply chain and the suppliers of their suppliers, and to have a deep dive on where this stuff is coming from.
Right.
And then actually, getting a team of people together to do the math and to check with those suppliers and those suppliers of the suppliers. I don't think you're going to get aggregate data unless maybe if you have a Bloomberg terminal, which I don't. But I think it's about getting good data. This is all about detection, which is about understanding where the hell we are today. Somebody else asked, does this show the weakness in just-in-time inventory? Of course it does. Of course it does. It shows that when you have the supply chain managers who are basically evaluated on having the lowest cost of stock and the lowest cost of shipment and everything else, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
This is what's going to happen.
Very good.
Here's a great question. What does this mean for Europe? Will Italy have it in control in 1 month? I wish I knew. I mean, it's a great question. How long is this going to be in place? Specific examples for scenario planning. McKinsey published a report recently, and they talked about 3 scenarios. So one scenario is this thing that runs for about a month or 2, another that is 3 or 4 months, and the other is going to take a year. and they have economic impact of those three things, everywhere from a couple of percentage points off of global growth to a major recession. You can buy that kind of stuff. You can read that kind of stuff. I think it's better to make your own scenarios with your own people, and I think your own people can be creative enough and smart enough to make up their own stories, and then to think about what those stories mean. Maurizio is saying that they formed a small team of data scientists to analyze the impact on their supply chain. Yeah, I mean, all of your companies can do this, even small and medium-sized companies, which is, what does this mean for our business? How long can we survive, in which case? And that's what takes you to this phase of inventing, which is how do we think through an approach in the this kind of blows over pretty quickly scenario. Okay, probably most of us can do that, but can we invent a system which is going to get us through in a world where COVID-19 is around for a while? That's, I think, the bigger challenge.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about the business, things that we can do together as executives. So individually, as you don't have to be the CEO to be the leader. I mean, everybody here, this is actually an element of a crisis situation, is how everybody individually steps up and exhibits their own leadership and the opportunity to reflect on what individually each of us is doing, how we respond. Are we responding, gauging our level of emotional response, gauging our level of logical, business-oriented response, being able to see both short-term and long-term, but really this about our teams, about thinking of the other people in our organizations, our customers, our vendors, and how we are individually responding and reacting to that. And so it's that combination of reflecting individually, but knowing that you're not alone. So you don't want to be able to feel like you're the only house standing here in this image.
And Kip, on that, the only last point I'd make, and I think we probably need to wrap this up pretty soon, is whatever you do, it's probably a good idea to check in with your colleagues and your superiors if you have them. Is this the right line? Is this line we're following? I mean, in my own case, I'm all about business as usual, and I'm washing my hands a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I think people should do. Now, I think our dean also has the same approach, and that's about getting the people in a leadership position, people are looking at, to be on the same page.
Right.
And I think it's important to do that, and it's important to make sure that you're comfortable with the page that you're on.
Yeah. Yep. So I think the fact that all of you joined us today and are thinking about being proactive, about working through the different elements that Mike has discussed, getting to that inventing stage and the mobilizing stage, thank you for being here, and as you reflect on this call, please go have conversations with your colleagues and help them also feel comfortable and feel that they're contributing to a solution. Certainly we want to help. Any ideas or any needs from us, you can contact us at custom programs at IESE.edu. We're very happy to support you with any actions that you want to take. And with that, I want to thank Mike very much for being here, for putting this together. Thank you all. Thank the team from around the world for joining us, and let us know how we can help. But for that, we'll let you get back to your work, and again, stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much.